Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we are going to hear about the book Women Against Violence Against Women, edited by Dusty Rhodes and Sandra McNeil. It's going to be discussed by Sheila Jeffreys, Julia Long, and Sandra McNeil. So thank you so much to our discussants, and over to you.
Thanks, Jo. Morning, everybody. It's really lovely to be here as ever. So yes, today we're going to be talking about, I'm not sure, probably can't see it very well there, about this this wonderful book, Women Against Violence Against Women, which was published by Only Women Press in 1985, and it was edited by Dusty Rhodes and, of course, Sandra McNeil. So I'm so happy that Sandra is here to tell us a bit about the genesis of the book and the production of the book and how it all came about. I'll just say a couple of things very briefly. The book is structured in 3 sections, and each section is a series of papers from a particular conference on violence against women. I know Sandra's going to say a little bit more about that. There were conferences from the early 80s, Sexual Violence Against Women Conference from Leeds in 1980, Women Against Violence Against Women Conference, London, 1981, and Male Power and the Sexual Abuse of Girls from a conference in Manchester held in 1982. So it's very much a collection of the feminist thinking and the women's liberation movement of that time. And one of the things that I really, really like about the book is that there are just so many voices included. It's based. I'll let Sandra tell you more about this, but the papers come from those conferences, so they're quite short. A huge amount in each one, and I think there's a really rich combination of women's testimonies and experiences about their lives, along with the kind of theorizing and analysis that goes along with that. So I think we're really in for a treat today, especially hearing from Sandra and from Sheila, who obviously was very much active and contributed to the book. I'll just say a little bit about when I first read the book, because I read it a lot later. I read it probably about 20 years after it was published. I may have been aware of it before then, but I only actually read it. In fact, it was even a bit over 20 years after it was published. I read it as part of my reading for my PhD. And at the time, I really focused on the chapters on pornography because that was sort of central to my PhD thesis. And I remember talking about the book in my thesis because what was really striking to me was that when I was interviewing the sort of often younger female activists who were active against the sex industry and pornography probably it was about 25 years later, around sort of 2008 to 2010, their objections to pornography and why they were so motivated to join in this activism basically echoed what had been said so much earlier on. Some of it was almost like word for word, very, very similar analysis of pornography in the book. So I thought I was very, very struck by that, and it was really good to go back and revisit and to put some of my interviews and the testimonies of the women I was speaking to into that context. So I just found it a really insightful book. Jo, could I just have the first slide and I'll give a brief overview before handing over to Sandra. Thank you. So I thought it might be helpful just to have an idea of where we're going with the session. So I'm going to hand over to Sandra, and then she'll hand over to Sheila. Sandra will be talking about how the book came about and her experience of editing it, and then Sheila's going to talk about why the book is so important. And then after that introductory part, Sheila and I will then go on to talk about some specific chapters in a bit more detail. So Sheila will be talking about the sex therapy chapter. I'll be talking about the age of consent chapter, which Sandra was one of the co-authors of that paper. Sheila will talk about the indecent exposure chapter that she wrote. I'll speak about a chapter from quite late on in the book, Fashion as Violence Against Women. If we don't have time to do all of them, I think we're going to possibly skip the chapter on prostitution, and then hopefully we'll have time to talk about the paper on sexual initiation as rape. Yeah, so you'll see there's a huge range of subjects covered in the text. So that's fine for that slide. Thanks, Joe. And I'll hand over to you now, Sandra.
Hello, I'm Sandra McNeil. Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the idea of putting together these conference papers in a book was Dusty Rhodes' idea. And hi, Francis, I saw your message in the chat. I recently met someone at a funeral who is in touch with Dusty, and I've sent her a message, but I don't know actually where she is. So it was Dusty's idea to get these papers together. I'm not really an ideas person, but I know a good idea when I hear it. So I'm really glad we got them saved in a book. Recently, a lecturer in cultural studies at Leeds University came to me to ask me to give a talk to her students. Well, of course, about Reclaim the Night. That's what we're always being asked to talk about. Al Garthwaite said to me recently, "You think nothing else?" Anyway, she said, could I put Reclaim the Night in the context of what was happening at the time? So I talked to her about Women Against Violence Against Women groups and explained that there were about 40 of them in the country and they were all very active. And I lent her the WAVAW book. And when she came back, she'd been absolutely blown away by it. She said, would I talk about that instead? Would I talk about WAVAW to her students? So I did. And one of them is going to write her thesis on it. So I'm really glad we've got them saved in that book. We didn't get the PVAW conference. Now, to my thinking, there were actually 4 Women Against Violence Against Women conferences. There was Sexual Violence Against Women in Leeds, where WAVAW was set up. There was the WAVAW conference itself in London. There was Male Power and the Sexual Abuse of Girls from Manchester. And then there's Porn is Violence Against Women in Oxford. And that conference had just happened when the book was about ready to go. And we wanted to include it, but that would have been another delay, and we wanted to get the ideas out. So I'm afraid we missed the papers from PVAW. I mean, all the papers are in Feminist Archive North, but conference papers very seldom taken out. And so we didn't include the PVAW conference. Now, it wasn't just a question of shuffling together some papers and sending them to only women. It was actually a very long process because all these papers were written for women-only conferences. And we were going to publish them for the world at large. So the main thing that slowed up the editing process was tracing every single woman, every woman who'd been in a group, because some of them were written collectively. So we had to get in touch with every single woman. If we couldn't get in touch with her and get her written agreement to publish it, then the paper couldn't go in, and some papers didn't go in. There were several papers anonymous. As I said, some were by groups, a lot of them written collectively, the such and such group. Some were written by Mary or Anne. So the editing process was quite long. And then when we got in touch with them, some of them wanted to improve their papers. I could have put that better. Let's make that clearer. Well, okay, if you want to change a little thing, make it clearer, we don't mind. One woman rewrote her paper to say the opposite of what it had said at the conference. Another woman who was an academic rewrote it as an academic paper. Nope. So, if they insisted on that, their paper didn't go in. So it was quite a long editing process. which is why we didn't get the PVAR conference in, because it would have delayed another year or 2 years. Another reason I was very glad that we got this book out was because of Andrea Dworkin. Andrea had just been over here doing a promotional tour for her book, Pornography, Men Possessing Women. And she was agreeably surprised by the number of women here who came and were enthusiastic about the book and came up and told her about all the actions that we were taking against pornography. And she took me to one side and she said, I was so surprised at this because I thought there was nothing in Britain but socialist feminism, because that's what all the books were. And she said, Sandra, at some point you're going to have to stop this activism and write a book. Well, of course, I never did. But we did get these papers out, because although we weren't writing books, we were all writing papers. Hundreds of us wrote papers. We wrote them individually, we wrote them collectively. We had confidence that we could write papers. And at conferences, the ideas in the papers were discussed. My friends will know that I'm about to go off on one about conferences. Back at the Women's Liberation Movement, we had these brief papers that we got in advance or that were there on the day. And then at the workshops, we just sat there and discussed the ideas. And out of those discussions came campaigns, came actions, came lots of action came from the workshops. Unlike today, where we go to conferences and spend the whole time sitting listening to other women talking. You spend an hour listening to one or maybe 3 women, grab a coffee and go somewhere else where you just sit and listen to some more women. And nothing comes out of it. So I would like to see conferences getting back to where they were, where we can write brief papers and discuss ideas and things can come out of them at the conferences, because that's what these papers led to. I mean, if we hadn't done it that way, we wouldn't have had a women's liberation movement. It wouldn't have come out of sitting, listening to women who know better than us talking to us. So yes, bring it back, I agree. Now, I've got a bit of good news to finish with. I looked for the WAVAR book, and the last time I'd looked for it, there were lots of copies available secondhand, but they seem to have been pretty much mopped up. So a friend of mine has offered to digitize it. I don't know if she's going to do it or get some technician in her university to do it, but scan it and send it to me electronically, so that in the future, I'm not saying instantly, but soon, and I'll let everybody know, you'll be able to contact Feminist Archive North and get your own electronic copy of the WAVAR book. So that's my good news. I'm now going to hand over to Sheila Jeffreys.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And you've said several of the things I'm going to say, which is great. I mean, 2 minds, but with single thoughts about what's wonderful about this book, which is great. I mean, I hadn't looked at it for 40 years. And when I went back to look at it, I realized that my name was on the introduction with your name and Dusty's name. And I couldn't remember any of that. So that was really interesting to me. I knew the book was marvelous. I knew that really well. So what I'm just going to say at the beginning is some of the reasons why I think it's marvelous. And some of them are the same reasons that you think is marvelous. First of all, the fact that the papers were written by at least, if I count a group as one person and a woman as one person, by at least 60 different groups or women, which is completely extraordinary. So what it means is that the writings represent the ideas and politics of very, very many women. and not just a few, as is usually the case with collections. You have like 10 papers and so on. So we know the ideas in the book were very widely held in the women's liberation movement, even if Andrea Dworkin was not aware of it at the time. So these were the ideas of a movement, and now they are pretty much unknown. So it's fantastic if this book is digitized. I think that would be great, so that women actually know what really was going on, what an incredibly lively and productive movement we had. So also what you said, and I think is very important, is that the papers were presented in a way unique to that time, a way which was egalitarian. Because now, as you say, conferences are all speakers and very few speakers. So women are not involved in their conferences. There's not a movement in the sense that women are talking about their ideas with each other, creating actions with each other. None of that's really happening now. And so women, of course, wrote papers on their typewriters. I think the technology is important. And if they were by groups, then the groups got together, discussed the ideas, someone went off and wrote it down. Then it was typed onto a wax sheet. They went to the local women's centre, printed it on their Gestetner, lots of copies, so that they could take it to the workshop, put it on tables just inside the door, and women could decide which workshops about those papers they were going to go to, so that they could discuss the ideas in the papers. And this is very difficult to understand now. I think young women don't know that such a process could happen. So I say this because I emphasize it because our means of communication are so very, very different now. We don't write papers for conferences. Conferences have speakers, and as Sandra says, you have to go and sit and listen, and that's actually pretty boring because you want to join in. Obviously, you want to join in. And there's no fire. Things don't take off. There are sort of stage standing up and down and sort of clapping and for special speakers and so on, but there isn't a sense, there's no egalitarian movement going on. Today, the bloggers, there are bloggers, lots of feminist bloggers, and that's good, but they're journalists. They tend to be professionals, and some are good. But back then we didn't have women journalists involved in our movement. There were not many women journos at all at that time, and women didn't see themselves as writers. And I mean, we could argue, can we bring back those days? And that's a really interesting question, because since those heady days, women have gained many things. They have become journalists and academics. They have done research. They have written books. They are in a position to be seen as stars now and to front conferences and impart information. So we now have speakers. We have experts now. We were all experts then because we mainly talked from our own experience, and we all had experience. That's what the movement was based on. And the issues were new at the time in a way that they're not necessarily now, because a lot's been written since. So I think it's an interesting question whether we can go back to those kind of conferences and get women involved in a way that we were at that time. It's so different now, and it's pretty boring now. And, we need fire again. Now, another really important aspect, I think, is the extraordinary originality of the papers. They cover so many different forms of violence against women that many of them have been researched and written about since, but there was not much about them then. Apart from some papers and a couple of books that reached us from the US, otherwise we developed the ideas in groups and from consciousness raising. So we created those ideas. So they were, to a large extent, new or being developed by us in new ways. But what I think is most remarkable is how profound the analyses were in those papers. Many of the papers address issues that went right to the roots of women's oppression and would never be recognized as forms of violence against women today. One, for instance, is fashion, which Julie is going to talk about. There are several papers on what was then and would now be seen as ordinary heterosexual sex, on sexual initiation of rape, and on the violence that is sex therapy, on sexual fantasies, women's sexual pleasure, and how that eroticizes sexual violence. And on obstetric care as sexual violence, there's a little bit of that today, but it's not a big issue. And gynecologists then were overwhelmingly men, and so that was an issue for us. One paper is simply on mixed wards as a form of men's sexual violence, And today's these really radical ideas are almost completely expunged from the culture and they are forgotten. Feminism is very superficial now. It doesn't go very deep. It doesn't talk about the conditions of women's everyday lives in the way that we did. And it doesn't come from women's experience directly in the way that it did then. So it's that's why reading the book is so extraordinary. It's so radical compared with the very limited ideas, campaigns, and so on that we're able to think of as feminism now. So I think I'll stop that little intro section and maybe we could have the next slide, Jo. So I'm going to just talk about a paper in the book that I really liked. There's two papers in the book on sex therapy. And what's important to understand is that in the 1970s women's liberation movement, there was a profound critique of therapy of all kinds. Our ideas came out of the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s, when there was a swinging critique of psychiatry, mental hospitals, pills, and much of therapy. And this critique doesn't exist now, when women are once again under the thrall of psychiatry and particularly therapy. You know, all the new sort of diagnoses that are being created for women. Women have got autism, they've got ADHD, they're suffering from menopause and can't really work properly anymore. All of this kind of stuff we were totally rejecting at the time. All of these diagnoses of why women were inferior, not okay, just couldn't really function. And the American feminist Louise Armstrong wrote one of the first books against father rape, Kiss Daddy Goodnight, in 1979. And she argued later that an industry of therapy was created by feminists aimed at fitting women who'd been raped by their fathers back into male domination. Incest was never ended, and of course it's hardly talked about now. Nobody really talks about that. It's disappeared as a feminist issue. But women were hugely therapized in the 80s and 90s, particularly those who've suffered men's violence, and women are hugely therapized now. Therapy, Louise Armstrong wrote, and many of us in the 70s were already saying, was anti-feminist and anti-revolutionary. So let's look at what Leslie H., who wrote this paper, is saying here about therapy generally. She says, as we grow and change, we develop survival tactics, ways of living with as little pain as possible in a hostile world. Therapists want us to get rid of whatever survival tactics we've learnt and to get rid of the protective wall we've built up around us. When a woman is raped or beaten by men, they want to make sure that she doesn't learn anything that might be to her advantage in dealing with them. She should have therapy to conform to their idea of what a normal woman should be like. Now, I think it is extraordinary that women are supposed to be raped by men, sexually abused by them in childhood, and still heterosexuality survives. Romantic love survives. I mean, that's extraordinary. And maybe it couldn't survive now because feminism brought all of these things to attention. Without therapy, women have to be therapized back into being able to be penetrated by men, into being able to love them. Because the more women are aware of and start talking together about what's actually going on out there, the fact that they're terrified to walk down the street at night, and so on, and yet they have to be in heterosexuality and have these loving relationships with men. How, without therapy, is it possible to make all of that happen? But it has to happen because that heterosexuality is the basis of the way male domination works. Can we have the next slide, Jo? Now, in this paper, the Leslie H. Talks about this a discussion within Women's Voice, which was a women's group. A discussion about Women's Voice. Women's Voice was a magazine which was a socialist feminist type of magazine, and what was in the magazine was discussed in a women's group in York because the sex therapy section of it was so horrifying. It's exactly the same as you get in women's magazines now. in all of the advice columns and so on. And so let's look at this. This is supposed to be feminist. This is the question to the advice section of a women's magazine, a supposedly feminist magazine. My baby is now 6 months old, and since his birth, I haven't wanted to make love to my husband at all. I am really getting worried in case I am frigid, even though I enjoyed sex very much before I had my baby. My husband is getting fed up, and it is causing a lot of arguments. That could be in any women's magazine today. I mean, it would be and is in every women's magazine today. That's completely normal. But why the hell should she do sex with this man, be sexually penetrated, if she doesn't want to? Why on earth should she? What that says is that woman is simply a sexual servicing machine, and she has to be got back into, she has to be oiled so that she can be used again, even though she doesn't want to do it. Why the hell? I mean, that's the very sort of fundament of women's liberation, is the fact that women have to do this, whether or not the hell they want to do it. So the women's group, the York Women's Group, talked about this. They were horrified by it. Remember, 45 years ago. And the therapist at the women's magazine tells the woman that she shouldn't worry. She should satisfy her husband by other means or go to a therapist. Right? So this is where the therapy comes in, fitting women back in, making sure they do their work. There's nothing in Women's Voice about how the woman could say no, or how she could tell the husband even to help with the baby. I mean, the husband is simply a god that she has to keep making happy, whatever the job that she's actually doing, such as having babies, looking after them, and so on. So what I love is that the women in the York Feminist Group who are commenting on this say that it means, i.e., pull up your socks and pull down your knickers, which I thought was splendid. I mean, we did have a sort of line in humour at the time, not quite as much today as we did then. We just had a wonderful time pulling all of these things apart, but all of them are completely, absolutely 100% the centre of culture now. So unfortunately, our attempts were completely a failure in respect of sex. Okay, I think it's probably over to you, Julia.
Sorry, I hadn't realised I'd been muted. Sorry about that. Yeah, Sheila, I was just going to say, before I talk about the next chapter, I'm so pleased that you chose that chapter to talk about, because I completely agree with you that the range of topics in this book is just incredible. I don't think we'd have a book published on violence against women now that covered the kind of everyday aspects of women's lives, in the way that you're talking about. And I'm really struck as well that, in terms of the violence against women sector, whether it's sort of, voluntary agencies, public sector funding, etc. Therapy and counselling is seen as such a part of the sort of package of responses to, part of the support package for a woman who's experienced male violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, etc. It's just seen as a good thing that, and I think it raises a lot of very interesting and important challenges, I think, to what's going on. I often used to feel when I was working in that sector that the fact that it's become a sector actually acts as a barrier to a women's liberation movement, because it just treats everybody, each woman, as an individual woman who's then given therapy, and it kind of contains, her experience, instead of being allowing access to a collective anger, that's very politicizing and mobilizing. It's actually the therapy is used to put a halt to that, I think. So I was really pleased that you selected that chapter. So anyway, if I could have the next slide, please, Jo. Thank you. So yeah, so I chose the chapter. I'm slightly hesitant to talk about it with Sandra here. Sandra's one of the authors of this chapter, but I was really struck when I read this. Obviously, it's so many years after it was published. That it coincides with, I don't know, those women who are in the UK. I don't know if this is available abroad, but there's actually a series on BBC Radio 4 at the moment called In Dark Corners, that is about the emergence and the influence of this this particularly vile group called the Paedophile Information Exchange, or PI, that came about in the 1970s, and I think they finally were disbanded in around 1984. But they really tried to gain credibility and gain a foothold in the politics of the time, and many of the very influential organizations at the time, such as the National Council for Civil Liberty, which was a precursor to Liberty, so human rights, or we could say men's rights organization that still exists now. And anyway, it was basically an organization of child abusers, and one of their main political aims was to reduce the age of consent to 4 years old. That was what they were about. They wanted to basically decriminalize child sexual abuse. And it's very I think if you can listen to this program, I really recommend it. It was very educational for me. The team who were producing the program gained access to a huge list of all these members of PI, of the Paedophile Information Exchange, and many of them had gained a lot of prominent positions and positions of influence within things like the National Body for Social Work and things like that. So it makes pretty terrifying listening. So one of the things, obviously, there are lots of parallels now with the ways in which the whole transgender movement, gender identity movement has followed a very similar path of trying to piggyback onto different aspects of rights for particular groups and liberation movements. The Paedophile Information Exchange did gain footholds with groups such as the Gay Liberation Front and other of these kinds of social movements at the time. And I think it's very, very striking that it was at the time the feminists, the revolutionary feminists, radical feminists, who were the ones who really were not hoodwinked by them in the way that some of the other groups were. So I think this is a really important piece, and particularly as I say, given the very sort of dangerous inroads that PI had made at the time. So but one of the things that strikes me in the arguments that the piece makes is the fact that they actually had to set out arguments for something that I think now, it pretty much would universally be, this kind of attempt to get rid of the age of consent or to lower it would be seen as wrong. I do think that is a big difference. And the fact that that the authors of this piece, Sandra and Valerie, had to set out, to really explain, take on each argument that they were making and explain why it was wrong, I think is really illustrative of the inroads that it had made at the time. And the fact that, feminists were being, like, if I give you this first quote here, supporters of the Paedophile Information Exchange, PI, berate feminists for using the concept of the child molester in our arguments. It's not the concept that worries us, it's the reality. So, bringing things back to reality. But I think words like berate, and later on, we've been accused, what they're being accused of. In supporting the age of consent, we have been accused of telling young women what to do. This accusation obscures the fact that a vast body of people, mostly adult men, are already telling young women what to do, and they go on to list all the different kinds of pressures on young women to basically sexually service men. But I think I found these words berate and accuse very interesting, because it shows that that feminists were needing to defend their position in a way that I think is so parallel to what's going on now, when we're needing to defend women, things that we would have thought should be obvious: the need for women-only spaces, the need for protection of young lesbians from child abuse and harmful practices. And so I think this really illustrates the influence at the time. And I think it really is a huge source of of pride in the fact that the feminists absolutely saw the very obvious harms of what these men wanted to do, and were the ones that really spoke out against it. And I think there's a lot to be learnt from that when we speak out against these other harms that aren't really recognised now. So yeah, I think did I have another quote? Can I have the next slide, or that might just have been the. Yeah, no, I'll hand back over to Sheila then for this. I'll hand over to Sheila for her next piece.
Okay. Thanks, Julia. So I think that actually the campaign against the getting rid of the age of consent that all of us were involved in, really, in the late 1970s was terribly important and very, very effective, really. We were really fighting it, and I don't think anybody else was. So, yeah, that was really important. In the same way as radical feminists and radical lesbian feminists founded this campaign against gender identity and all of that. I mean, we were always there. So, yes, in the book, I've got a piece on indecent exposure, and let's just see where that came from. Indecent exposure is the sort of technical term usually used by sexologists about men's practice of flashing or masturbating at girls and women in public places, which is really what it is. They get their penis out and they masturbate at you. And I wrote the paper a couple of years before the 1980 conference at which it was shared. And I was interested in it because I had experienced it 3 times as a child and young woman, starting at the age of 8 or 9 on a beach in Malta, where a man came up to some girls who were, including myself, who were playing there, and I told them to pick up their shoes and run while I would deal with the man. I was always trying to be brave, even at 9, and I knew they needed a bit of a start. So he came up and stood beside me and took this huge purple thing out and said, "Stroke my little pet." I did not, of course. That was my first experience of indecent exposure. And I remember reading in my mother's Woman's Own magazine a piece by a sexologist, Anthony, somebody or other, back in the early 1960s, about indecent exposure and how common it was. And he said, there were women who complained that they often saw men exposing themselves, and they still went into the parks and things where they got indecently exposed too, and they could reasonably be said to be seeking it out. If it often happened to them, they were seeking it out, which did seem to me a problem at the time. I was probably only about 12 or 13, and I'd already had a couple, and I thought, what is that saying? So I was very interested in the issue because, of course, the sexologists at the time thought it was absolutely harmless. Girls should laugh. I can remember even some feminists back in the day saying, you should laugh at it. You should just laugh. It's not a problem. You should just laugh, which was absolutely extraordinary. Everybody was trying to treat it like, seeing spiders. Why are you frightened of spiders? You should all just laugh. But in the late 1970s, I was starting to read the sexologists on all of this to see what they had to say. And they said, I should actually read you some of the explanations that the indecent exposers gave, first of all, because they are fun. These are in the sexological texts where they say what the men say about what they were doing. And they say it was drunkenness, amnesia, drugs, a desire to urinate, zipper trouble, and this is my favorite. My zipper comes undone sometimes, and things pop out. So that's what the chaps say. Or they say it was a mistaken identity. It wasn't their penis. It was really a pop bottle. Anyway, apart from this moment of humor, and lots of sexological writing is actually quite humorous, I have to say, we need to see what they really thought. So if we look at what the sexologists think about flashing, they say it wasn't serious because similar considerations lack of seriousness apply to other sexual behaviors such as homosexual relations between consenting post-pubertal partners, voyeurism, and exhibitionism. Whether they even inflict enough psychological harm to warrant unusual attention on the part of society is, debatable, says this sexologist Halleck in 1962. So in other words, it was just like homosexuality. In fact, completely harmless, and we should laugh at it or just not notice, I guess. However, my perspective on this was different, and my statement about it. Could we have a next one, please, Joe? I said in my paper, flashing is a crude way of showing authority, like wearing a prefix tie or flashing your identity card might be if you were a policeman. A flasher's message is simple: I rule because I have a penis. So I saw it as aggressive and about power at that time. And I think that was probably, hopefully, that was comforting to all of those women and girls who've had this act of aggression conducted against them many, many times, but never been allowed to take it seriously. Now, we do know now that flashing is serious. There are sexological writings which do show how boys who engage in flashing as teenagers, where they very often do start doing this behavior, will go on to other forms of violence against women, really serious sexual violence against women. So it's not harmless at all, but simply the beginnings of a career of sexual violence. And when looking at this again, what came to my mind was the case of the policeman in the UK who murdered a woman in the street. Now, in 2021, in the UK, a policeman called Wayne Couzens, who was a flasher, kidnapped and killed a woman called Sarah Everard, who was walking home one evening in London in 2021. Now, he used his badge to intimidate her in the street, so I thought it was quite interesting because I was talking about the identity card and so on. And he bundled her into his car, so he's using two forms of his identity, as it were. Now, he had used his penis to commit several flashing offences, which were known to the police from 2015 onwards. And in fact, he committed one of these offences 4 months before the murder, when he flashed a female cyclist. In no case were these offences followed up, although this could have prevented the murder. A policeman flashing, you would think, should have been seen as serious, but all the cases were simply dismissed as trivial. And the result of that was that a woman lost her life. So I just think it's interesting that I was trying to get this taken seriously 45 years ago, nearly 50 years ago, in fact. I think I originally wrote it in 1978. But we're still at this stage where the police, let alone the sexologists, see it as completely unimportant, and it can lead to women's deaths. Okay, so that's it for indecent exposure. I think it's back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Sheila. I'm not muted. Joe, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So yeah, the next paper that I chose to talk about is this one, Fashion as Violence Against Women. It's a very short paper. It's just a couple of pages. It's by a non, so I'm quite curious as to who it might have been, writing it all those years ago. But I chose this this piece because I was just so pleased to see this topic addressed within this. I think it's one of the areas, as Sheila was saying, that is just very, very remains very undiscussed at the moment, apart from present company accepted. And I like it, the very assertive opening of the chapter. Fashion is not just a trivial, insignificant area of women's lives. If we choose to ignore it, its effects, its reasons for being do not just disappear. It's a vital element of our oppression, especially effective because the majority of workers in the fashion industry are women. Therefore, it serves to obscure male power by using women as agents. So one of the things that I was particularly pleased to see about this chapter is that I think it just serves to expand the understanding of the all-expansive nature of men's oppression of women and male violence against women, into all these very everyday kind of aspects of women's lives. And I do think it's really striking that if I think back to when this was written in the early 80s, and the kinds of clothing that was expected of women, and we see the kinds of clothing that women, maybe particularly but not exclusively young women, are expected to wear, and also all of the beauty practices that women are expected to subject themselves to, or be subjected to, all the kind of cosmetic surgery interventions, all the injectable fillers, all the rest of it. It's just become like a whole other thing. I think a whole level of things being far worse than they actually were then, but without this kind of critique. And as I was saying earlier, I think a collection on violence against women now, from the kinds of voices that we're hearing, the kind of journalists and writers that we're hearing, I don't think would address fashion in this way. It wouldn't see it as part of the continuum of male violence. So I was really really pleased just to see the way in which the understanding of male violence encompassed all of these kinds of aspects. So because it's such a short piece, the writer only really introduces lots of different points for discussion, and any one of these could be the basis of a much more in-depth discussion. But she raises issues such as how women are still very much judged on our appearance, and she asserts that a woman's appearance is her income. And we might like to think that that isn't the case anymore, but if we look at the ways in which women in the public eye, who have often achieved very, very high status and influential positions, are endlessly presented in the high heels, the revealing clothing, all of the kind of the dyed hair, the cosmetic surgery interventions, the Botox, all of these different things that we see, and the nails, the lashes, all of those things are just so much a part of how women are expected to present, and it seems that that's been the kind of bargaining chip that for women entering the public domain, that this is the kind of the payback that they have to what they have to seem to pay in order to be accepted in those positions. But she also talks about the fact that women are employed in the fashion industry, that for some women it's a source of income, but she goes on to say how that obscures the power of men, and particularly gay men, in the industry. She then has other arguments that she just touches on, all the harmful practices. I remember this this phrase from when I was a kid, people saying, oh, you have to suffer to be beautiful, and she talks about the diet industry, cosmetic surgery, all of those kinds of things. She talks about the very limiting effects of women's freedom on of restrictive clothing, the tight clothing, the high heels, etc., that serve to make women more vulnerable, and also to make women a target, to identify women as a target. And I think those kinds of arguments are really not made now, that everything has just been refracted through this lens of women's individual choice and freedom, and the idea of all of these things as being somehow kind of pleasurable and empowering, and all this whole kind of vocabulary that's used to obscure what is actually what fashion is actually doing. And then right at the end she talks about fashion and pornography, and she comes to the conclusion that fashion equals control equals violence against women. So it's a very short piece, but I think it's very, very suggestive, and it opens up lots of very important areas to discuss. Jo, could I just have that slide back, please? So yeah, I really like this quote, the second quote I've included there. The emergence of male homosexual sadism from the underground has coincided with the burgeoning of overt sadism against women in all communications. I think that is such an important, she's actually quoting this, I don't know if it's a group, Lavender Culture, or a book. She's actually quoting that, but I just think that is such a really insightful observation, and it goes on to it kind of prefigures Sheila's book on beauty and misogyny, and absolutely what we see in the culture now, where basically all the paraphernalia of sadomasochism has been turned into sort of quite everyday fashion items that are marketed to women. So if we can just see the next slide, I just included this illustration from 40 years later, where we see her words absolutely still resonating very clearly. These images are just from a couple of magazines from the last year or so. Fashion challenge: can you wear bondage to work without anyone noticing? These kind of like latex skirts and outfits, and then the stylish ways to wear latex in midlife. So it really shows how what she was saying there about this sort of culture of sadomasochism has just been so normalized. And what's striking, I think, in that the second image there is that we've got a younger woman, a middle-aged woman, and then we've got Prue Leith, who I think is in her early or mid-80s, also being, so that it seems like whatever age you are, you can't escape being marketed in this way. So yeah, I just thought that was a very insightful quote there that sadly is all too evident today. I'll hand back to Sheila. I think have we got time for just a few words of your chapter?
Oh, let's just have a quick look at it then. Can we have the next slide? Can I just say, in terms of Lavender Culture, Julia, I have got the book. It's a collection of gay liberation pieces from the US from very early. They're very strong in their feminist influences. It's a most interesting book. And it's definitely very much against sadomasochism. So it might be worth looking at, but it's at least half men in the book, and it's not specifically feminist, but it's a fascinating book. And it shows us what gay liberation was about at that time, when it was really very much connected with feminism and had these kinds of ideas. Okay, so the piece that I have in here, there wasn't very much written by feminists at the time, and I think I do explain in my paper on prostitution that there was a bit about prostitution in the 1970s coming out, which was basically saying feminists needed to support women in prostitution, and prostitution was just a work like any other, and we should all be supportive of them. Whereas I was in Women Against Violence Against Women, I wanted us to really look at this issue. And so I wrote this piece to have a feminist analysis of what was going on. And basically I said that men needed there to be prostitution, because they needed two kinds of relationship with women. They wanted the what I called the EDS relationship, emotional, domestic, sexual servicing relationship, for which they had wives. Then they needed to go off and be able to use women in the way suited to the development of male sexuality and to what they needed to do in terms of male sexuality. And that these two groups of women should never know each other. I mean, the woman in the EDS relationship could not say, "Oh, hello, Betty," in the pub to the woman who her husband used in prostitution. So it completely separated the class of women from one another, so, which was absolutely fundamental and is fundamental to the institution of prostitution. You just never get ordinary communication between the two kinds of women that the same men use. That's really not okay. But this is just one quote about what I was thinking at the time, that studying prostitutes to explain prostitution, we didn't use the term prostituted women at that time, is as useful as examining the motives of factory workers to explain the existence of capitalism. We must ask who benefits and whose interests the institution is maintaining, it should really say. Only examining the motives of the ruling class can tell us this. So I said we had to look at the men, see why they were using the women in prostitution. That was absolutely fundamental. I think that's probably... oh no, can we have the next slide quickly? And yes, so how many women know the men attached to them use prostitutes? I had to think about it because a male friend, a man I knew well and had lived with as a lover, who'd been a charming hippie, told me in an unburdening moment about his use of women prostitutes. He went to them to be whipped. That was a young man called Timmy, and that was in about 1971. So obviously what men do in terms of using prostitutes was very much in my mind. I'd completely forgotten that until I read this chapter. You know, all these very incidents in your past, which we use to create our analysis, the experience of our everyday lives. I had forgotten that bit. But then basically my analysis of prostitution was, it serves as a guerrilla training camp and rehabilitation center for sexual terrorists. So it trains men in sexual violence, which they yet then use against women in social control of women, and it trains them in that sexuality. There can never, of course, be any kind of egalitarian sexuality when men use women in prostitution. It trains them, it educates them. That's what it's for. And it actually trains them in sexual terrorism, the sexuality they need to use against all women in sexual terrorism. Okay, we'll leave that there. Back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Sheila. Can I have the next slide, please, Joe? So we're just in the final few minutes. I'm really pleased we managed to get all of these chapters in. So, yeah, so this chapter, or paper, I should say, on sexual initiation as rape was written by Annie Smith. I don't know what Annie is doing now, but I thought it was a really, really important piece. Again, for similar reasons as I've said about other pieces, is that it really opens up the discussion and the understanding of male violence against women by looking at these very, very common experiences and not just separating out these kind of bad things like prostitution, pornography, domestic violence as something kind of separate, these discrete separate issues, but actually looking at the commonality of women's experience. And it seemed to me that this paper had possibly come from some kind of consciousness raising session, because it opens with a question, very direct question. How do you feel about your sexual initiation? And then she goes on to say that at the end of the paper, there are three women's accounts of how they experienced it, which I must say are very moving and really, really quite upsetting. But I was very moved, and some of what they said certainly resonated. Anyway, she goes on. Was the loss of virginity seen as significant to you at the time? Have you thought about it since? Too often the experience is filed away in dusty crevices of the mind and forgotten. I wish to argue, however, that it is a crucial moment in securing our oppression and that there are reasons for our amnesia. And then she goes on to she quotes Simone de Beauvoir and Simone de Beauvoir's analysis of the significance of woman's initiation into heterosexual penetrative sex, into sexual intercourse, as a key moment in defining her as an oppressed being. Anyway, I particularly like this, as I say, because it expands it just creates a far more a comprehensive picture of the normality of male violence against women, and it sits alongside other pieces on heterosexuality that are called things like Why I Like Screwing, or Is Heterosexual Enjoyment Based on Sexual Violence, Male Violence and the Pressure to be Heterosexual, Every Woman's Experience of Marriage, and Rape in Marriage. So we've got these different pieces on heterosexuality and on marriage that, again, I think to me sat alongside some of the commentary that I see now, or have seen on discussions on social media and other kinds of current discussions, if we can even call them discussions, that basically just defend sexuality and sexual orientation as completely innate, and there's nothing to be said about heterosexuality at all, other than some women just are heterosexual, and that's it. And obviously alongside all of that, we've got these increasingly violent practices, anal intercourse, choking, sexual choking, all these different practices from sadomasochism that are, in a way, I think it's very parallel to what's happened in kind of the fashion and sort of beauty trends, is that things have become far more blatantly misogynist, far more blatantly violent and violating. At the same time, the sort of discussion about them has basically become invisible. So anyway, in this paper, we're just about coming up to time. If I can take maybe just a minute or two to go on and give the quote from the next slide. Can I have the next slide, please, Jo, just before we finish? She says, this is basically her argument. The first penetration is like a rite of passage for the young woman. It's her initiation into heterosexuality, which in this patriarchal society is the only socially accepted framework for sexual activity. Penetration is, of course, the standard practice. Moreover, the heterosexual couple is the structure whereby each woman has her own individual pressure. Sexual initiation, therefore, becomes an important issue as the point at which she loses her selfhood as a free, autonomous being and becomes a sexual servitor to the male. So that's basically how she's seeing the kind of social sexual meaning of this sexual initiation. And then the three testimonies after that really follow in very forensic detail the amount of pressure that each woman experienced, both prior, all the lead up, all the pressure that the men were exerting on the women, and then the situations they found themselves in, which which I would say certainly, at least in one case, was clearly rape, and certainly in the others there was absolute elements of coercion involved. So anyway, I think we'll have to leave it there. Sorry, we did run slightly over time, but I'm really pleased that we managed to at least touch on each of those chapters. So I think we will definitely be revisiting this book. Sandra, if you'd like to join us for that, I think that would be a fantastic session, and maybe particularly to talk about the conference on child sexual abuse that we didn't actually manage to address in this session. So I'll just say thanks so much, Sheila. Thanks so much, Sandra. Thanks everyone for your contributions. And yeah, I think we're finished for now, and see you all next week.